Hello and welcome back to our read through of the New Testament in 2026. We are hopping into this first week of February, and this week we're going to be reading Matthew chapters 21 through 25. Now, Matthew chapter 20, we saw that Jesus was starting to head towards Jerusalem. He was having some conflict with his disciples, more than just that they weren't understanding what he was trying to teach. And now he's in Jerusalem. And he enters into Jerusalem on what we have come to know as Palm Sunday, and everyone's excited. The people are going, they're waving their palm branches, they're calling out, Hosanna to the Son of David, Hosanna in the highest. They are expecting him to be this messianic figure who's going to come in and drive out their oppressors and reestablish the kingdom of Israel. And instead, what ends up happening is Jesus instead goes into the temple where people worship, and instead of worshiping, he starts going through the temple courts and overturning the tables of the moneylenders and those who are selling animals for sacrifice. And he's saying, "You have turned my Father's house from a house of prayer into a den of robbers." And from there, he starts teaching in the temple day by day. Now, the chief priests and the religious leaders, they are all there. They were the ones who sanctioned the approval for the money changers and the people selling sacrifices to be in the courts. And so now they have this Jesus guy who's just come from Galilee, who's just overthrown everything. And they've heard about him, sure. But now they're going to go and they're going to start trying to challenge him. They try to see what his authority is, where he's getting his authority to do these things. And he always answers them with different parables. And a lot of the parables are ones that take a dig at the religious leaders, saying, you haven't done what you have been called to do, what you have been supposed to have been doing. And so now everything needs to be fixed. We get to chapter 22, and the parable that he starts off with, the parable of the wedding feast, pretty much says that God has rejected the religious leaders, and he's going to start taking in people off the streets for this wedding supper, which represents heaven, because they have failed in their duties. They have rejected God in what they were doing. And we start to see in chapter 22, they start to, the different religious sects start to try and challenge Jesus in different ways. The Pharisees, who are the hyper-religious, they go to Jesus and say, is it lawful to actually pay taxes to the Romans? And Jesus answers, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. So he's not upsetting the people who believe that everything belongs to God, and he's not offending the Roman guards who were probably standing right there. Then the Sadducees come, and they ask him about the resurrection, which the Sadducees, they only hold to the first 5 books of the Bible. They don't believe in things like angels or an afterlife or a resurrection from the dead or the prophets. And so they're asking, well, what about the resurrection? And they give this ridiculous question, and Jesus basically says, that's a ridiculous question because you do not understand the word of God. And then you have the teachers of the law, or in what it calls in Matthew, a lawyer asks them, well, what commandment is the greatest? And Jesus says, honor God, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so they continue to challenge him, and they keep getting silenced by his answers. And then in chapter 23, he actually goes out against the scribes, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, and he gives them, we call them the 7 woes. This calling of almost, it's not quite a curse, but it's like a lament over who these people are and what they've been doing, because they've been so hypocritical, trying to look outwardly righteous while inside not actually putting their faith and trust in God's love, but rather in God's rules. And he cries over Jerusalem. In chapter 24, Jesus meets with his disciples, and they're sitting on the Mount of Olives, which looks out over top of the temple. And Jesus tells them that one day it'll all be destroyed. And they ask him about it, and he starts to foretell about the end of the age and the end of the world and all these different things. And depending on how you read this, some of this happened back in AD 70, but some of it still hasn't happened yet. But he tells them that it's going to get really bad, and then eventually he will come back. The Son of Man will come back, and they will gather together again. But he says no one knows when that's going to happen. He doesn't even know. The Son of God doesn't even know. Only God the Father. Chapter 25, he gives just a few more parables that sort of explain what he's trying to say here. One is the parable of the 10 virgins, where 5 have oil for their lamps and are ready in case things go wrong, and 5 don't, and they miss out on the wedding party because they had to go and buy more oil because they weren't ready. So he's telling us to be prepared. He says the parable of the talents, that those who take what God has given them and put it to use end up seeing this larger and larger and larger reward as a result. And he tells them that the final judgment, it'll come down to who is the ones who were being kind and generous and gracious to their neighbors, rather than the ones who were following the letter of the law of God without actually having any love for anyone else. So we get through this week, and what we see is Jesus' judgment isn't necessarily on the Romans or the oppressors. He's come to challenge the sins of mankind, and specifically the sins of the religious elite who loved God's law more than they loved God. And that's what he's trying to tell his disciples to avoid.